We have a great list of speakers here today for the land track session. Our speakers are Bronson Griscomb, Senior Director of Natural Climate Solutions, Conservation International, and he's also one of our XPRIZE judges for XPRIZE carbon removal. Tom Crowther, who's professor at ETH Zurich and co-chair of the advisory board of the UN Decade on Ecosystem Restoration, and he's one of our XPRIZE advisory board members. And for Vanessa Perez-Ciera, who's our Global Deputy Climate and Energy. She's Global Deputy of Climate and Energy at the World Wildlife Federation. She is also one of our XPRIZE advisory board members. So thank you very much to our speakers for joining us today. Thank you all for the last minute link change. We really want to make sure we can get as many people in as possible. So we kind of had to change the links last minute to accommodate the large volume of interest that we've gotten for these track sessions. So with that, quick agenda is we're going to take the next half hour or so to let our speakers speak. Then we will go into another half hour of Q&A, and the last hour we're going to reserve for networking breakouts for all of you. You'll be in different breakout rooms, and we'll rotate you every 15 minutes or so that you have time to introduce yourselves, give your elevator pitches to each other, and share contact details to collaborate and so forth if you're comfortable. So with that, I'm going to hand it off to our speakers to go ahead and get started.
Thank you. I think that was a cue for me. Is that right, Roopa?
Yes.
Okay.
Well, no particular order, but great. If you want to go ahead and get us kicked off, that would be great. Thanks, Bronson.
Okay, sure thing. So yeah, an honor and a pleasure to have a chance to connect with folks here. And yeah, as Roopa mentioned, I'm been asked to give an overview on some dimensions of this space. Obviously, there, lots of ways of looking at the space, but I'm going to give you an overview of some of the work that I'm aware of that I think may help clarify some dimensions, essentially accounting boundaries of this topic and this sort of different elements of this topic, and some kind of key issues that I think are quite relevant to clarify in proposals. And I think that it'll be really helpful to have some consistency in thinking about some of these key issues as folks prepare their proposals. Okay, so with that, let me share my screen. I've got a little short PowerPoint to walk through on some of the stuff, although much of it I'll just sort of talk without needing the PowerPoint. Okay, so again, my name is Bronson Griscomb. I'm at Conservation International. Let me just start with a real big picture here. Okay, so this is a diagram I just pulled off a website from NASA. But there are some distinct issues in the land space of carbon removal. One of them is to consider for a moment the sheer scale, the magnitude of fluxes of CO2, okay? And so that's what this figure is showing us, right? That whereas fossil fuel and other industrial kind of emissions are essentially in one direction, in the land and marines sector, they're in both directions, and they are huge. In fact, the vast majority of fluxes today remain essentially natural. The difference is that they're balanced, right? They're largely balanced. That the emissions are very similar, about the same as the removals, and in fact they're balanced, but slightly in our favor, which is why about half of anthropogenic emissions are actually being reabsorbed by natural systems. So why am I mentioning all this? It is for a practical reason, which is that in thinking about accounting for the land sector emission removals, we've got to deal with additionality. Okay, we can't just say, great, we're going to make sure that forests are restored, and there's forests being restored, and they're growing forests all over the place, right? To the tune, and not just forests, right? Other ecosystems. So there's massive removals occurring every year, far beyond, fossil fuel emissions. So it's critical to clarify what is the change in practice from a business as usual, right? So the key is that what I would refer to as natural climate solutions, but there are other terms people use, nature-based solutions. It's the shift in those fluxes, historic fluxes, not just the flux itself, okay? So I just want to emphasize that clarifying the additionality of that shift, that the shift from an existing practice or existing phenomenon is I think very important for that to be kind of credible as an actual solution. Now I'm going to dive in just a little bit more as by way of overview, and then on this papers, two papers. Sorry, I flipped this sequence. One paper that I led that back in 2017 called Natural Climate Solutions at PNAS that framed out kind of accounting boundaries for 20 different options. And then a paper just out, actually in 2021, Stephanie Rowe et al., that is the basis for the next IPCC Working Group 3 chapter that will be coming out in February. And so those are just, I just want to flag from my perspective, obviously just my perspective, but these are two important papers that can give some context on kind of accounting boundaries as you look at different options, measures to put forward, and sort of be consistent with what's some of the published literature that's out there. And there's lots of other published literature out there, needless to say, and I'm biased towards the stuff I've been involved with, but I'm just letting you know some that's out there. So for the 2017 paper we did, here's an example where we identified 20 different options in this space, and each one kind of has a certain accounting systems around it. Again, it's all additional. These are all involved in changes from business as usual that will deliver certain gigatons of climate mitigation across different countries and different geographies. And then if flagging, again, this is kind of from my perspective. I mean, this is this is I guess I defer to my XPRIZE staff colleagues, but the secret sauce of natural systems is that they're delivering often other co-benefits that that are particularly compelling. So I think it's at least worth flagging that and here in the chevrons, that a lot of these things are delivering multiple other things as well, whether it's water filtration, and I don't think it's much more complex to quantify that. And I'm not suggesting that folks would do that, but at least sort of so that if there's a basis for indicating these other benefits, it seems to me that that's helpful. And I'm just flagging some of the categories that have particularly strong co-benefits. All right, so then just to summarize that, I mean, in my mind, again, this is okay. You can use these kind of concepts if helpful. If not, then I wouldn't worry about it in this particular case. But I think of these three major categories: protect, manage, restore. The emphasis, of course, here is the removals, and so most of the rest. So the restoration of re-expansion of native ecosystems and the improved management of working lands, basically climate smart forestry and climate smart agriculture, and all the different dimensions of that are that restore and manage dimensions are kind of where all these removals fit in. And then I'm just flagging again, this is the Rowe et al. Paper, where the total potential that's been estimated here is around 14 gigatons per year. So it's a huge, massive opportunity. Obviously, I presume that's why many here are interested in so many proposals on this. So I'm excited about that. Now that's it for my slideshow. But here's what I want to just sort of dive in and here. Let me just stop sharing because On a few other more specific points. How do I stop sharing? Let's see. Stop share. There it is. Sorry. All right. So one other thing I want to focus on, if I have just a few more minutes, is this issue of durability. So we talked about additionality, right? But there's a requirement of a minimum of 1,000 tons per year with 100-year durability. That I sometimes I worry that could actually discourage folks in this space, because we know that natural systems have ongoing fluxes in many cases, and it depends. But so I think it's worth emphasizing some thoughts about how do we address the issue of durability in this space. So there are two ways, and this is, by the way, communication I had with XPRIZE staff, in particular Mike Leach, and so I think this is aligned, but I obviously welcome any sort of clarifications if I've sort of wandered off in this, but I think I'm well aligned with XPRIZE staff in saying this. So there are two ways to solve the durability requirement. One is to store carbon in a form that's sufficiently stable, right? So one can think about recalcitrant biochar, that would be, quite stable in the soil if it's properly implemented. And then if you can get it to a point where it's sufficiently stable that we can assume durability is approaching 100% over a 100-year period. Okay, that's one way of solving the riddle. But the other way, but that most forms of NCS wouldn't qualify for that, right? If it's a biomass storage, you can't assume that it's going to be durable. A tree will a tree live on for 100 years? Maybe, probably, maybe not. But there's another way of dealing with it, right? And so that is to essentially just quantify what that probabilistic durability is, and then deduct for that. So that if you need to deliver 1,000 tons per year that's durable, and here's an example, I think it was Mike's example. So if you know your sequestered CO2 has a half-life of 100 years, and that's just, you can expect 50% of the CO2 to be re-emitted within 100 years, then to achieve 1,000 tons per year, you need to sequester 2,000. And then you're deducting approximately half of that. That's a very hyper simplistic example, but that's one way that you can achieve that durability requirement. And that's key, is that it's a net durability. It's not an absolute, okay. And so a few other quick points, then I'll pass it on to my colleagues. One is scale. So one of the ways, if you think about an individual tree or an individual plant, sure, that, plants live and they live and then they die, and you can't always predict when. But when you get out to landscapes, that's where, at a stand level, as they say in forestry, but at a certain scale, then you get a much more kind of robust assumption about durability of that system. You could, of course, still have large scale disturbances and those sorts of things, and that's what you have to think about, what would be the probability of that given each system and the different locations. I will just add as another little quick thought is that some distribution is spatially is another way of kind of putting your eggs in different baskets to sort of constrain the probability, the risk of loss, right? And then it's essentially, what is the deduction that you need to apply if you're storing carbon in biomass? I should say living biomass. Then there's also related issues of leakage. I won't go into details, but to me, that's basically, so the durability is, in my world, the word we use is permanence. It's the same thing as durability. And then there's this leakage, which is basically displacement. So if you do an action in one place, if you plant some trees in one place, are you essentially going to displace the demand for that somewhere else, and then it doesn't happen somewhere else? I mean, there is an issue that sometimes, depending upon the intervention, you need to think about a leakage question, which is really, instead of it being kind of durability, is sort of a question about like additionality in over time, and leakage is sort of an additionality over space. So just again, just flagging, these are things to think about. Not all of these are necessarily something you have to, focus on a lot, depends, but it's something to consider in thinking about kind of the credibility of the accounting in your proposals. And then the final point I want to make is that in case, I think many folks here will be well aware that there are a lot of carbon accounting methodologies out there, especially in the voluntary carbon standards space, but there's other carbon standards out there. Of course, they're jurisdictional sort of and regulatory carbon standards. And so you don't have to, you don't want to just sort of reinvent the wheel. I would sort of start by being aware of what's already out there that you could either draw from and thinking about accounting systems to sort of, to justify the accounting. And then there obviously are some places where the accounting systems have not been developed. And then you'd of course have to, you wouldn't have that basis to start from. But I guess, I just encourage folks to kind of make sure to be aware of what's been done in the existing kind of both voluntary and regulatory standards, because there's been, well over a decade of work to clarify and to develop credible accounting systems that many of you all will be able to draw from in order to justify the accounting. And that's it for me.
Okay, I guess I'll take over from Bronson. Thanks so much for that, Bronson. I unfortunately have to admit that given the delays in this meeting, I unfortunately only have 1 minute before I must actually leave. But that's very fortunate because Bronson covered all of many of the things that I was going to introduce in my presentation, and obviously many of these things are not new at all to you guys who are leading these innovations. So I think it's fantastic. Bronson covered those, the challenges with carbon accounting and getting it right. And essentially that's going to be a really important part of the board process, I think. From my own perspective, I'm not going to even share my slides because I haven't got enough time to even touch on them. But my own perspective, I'm an environmental scientist and an ecologist. And so I'm bringing in a focus on the sort of biodiversity and ecosystem services perspective of the prize and of the challenges, and ultimately I think there's going to be a huge focus, as everyone on this call is very aware, on the co-benefits that come with nature-based solutions and the thousands of co-benefits, many of which are being discussed in the chat right now. But among them, obviously, ultimately all of them, whether it's cooling or water security or food or medicine or timber provision, ultimately these come down to improving biodiversity and improving local well-being. And I think these co-benefits are one of the huge benefits of nature-based solutions and natural carbon drawdown. And they are what, if we say that nature-based solutions are able to contribute 20 to 30% of carbon drawdown, this is a massive potential. But I would argue that the co-benefits vastly outweigh those direct carbon benefits, as I'm sure many of you do. But what I would like to focus on is that those co-benefits are also the biggest risks in the nature-based solutions space. So when things go wrong, then it's ultimately those ecosystem services, well, particularly the focus on carbon, can lead to a misrepresentation of biodiversity and local people in those solutions. And when we get them wrong, that's when the huge risk of the carbon focus can be realized. And so I just want to put forward that in evaluating any of these solutions, I think there's going to be a heavy focus on the ability not only to evaluate the carbon impacts and the carbon capture and all the things Bronson mentioned, but measuring and reporting on in a very transparent way those co-benefits and how they relate to biodiversity and people. And I think those cannot only be forgotten, that they should be at the very forefront of the way we report transparently on these processes. And I think one final thing is I'd like to bring in the idea that somehow we need to build in an approach that recognizes the transparent reporting of the failures and the challenges in these processes, as well as just the successes. Because what prizes like this can do is promote the successes and increase and lead to us essentially hiding data on the failures. And ultimately, it's those failures that are going to lead to the learnings that will improve the successes for everyone else and make these nature-based solutions truly scalable. So those are just my brief thoughts and a brief summary of my 10-minute presentation. But I'll hand it over to Vanessa, who will give a much better deep dive on that. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Thomas, and thank you, Bronson. And I'm going to repeat a lot of what my colleagues have said, so I'll go quick and probably give you some additional perspectives. But I'm really happy that we're all kind of in the same page in terms of what the key message that we want to kind of bring forward here and try to decrease the fear of going for nature-based solutions. So I'm sure you know these 3 1.5-degree trajectories of IPCC. Of course, all of them require deep decarbonization of all systems, actually, but of course with a focus on the energy system, and the second two scenarios look at BECCS, of course, and all of the 3 scenarios have an important land-based component, as my colleagues have mentioned. One of the things that I love about these 3 scenarios is of course that we look at this halting deforestation bit here, which is kind of something that we must also address very, very rapidly. And sometimes some of the messages that get across when one sees these things is that one tends to say, well, shall we do one instead of the other? Or I think we're very much at a moment in time in which we need all hands on deck, and we need all hands on deck very, very importantly. Having said that, of course, as WWF, we prefer scenario 1 and 2 rather than scenario 3, as scenario 3 starts to get more complicated with BECCS and a lot of uncertainties there. And I think in the afforestation and reforestation and land use bit of things, there are some, of course, uncertainties, but I think that we've kind of analyzed them strongly, and as my colleague said, I think the co-benefits outweigh. Why the case for nature-based solutions? This is a report that we put out earlier this year that's called Powering Nature, and it's very much taking IUCN definition of nature-based solutions, but really clarifying that the 5 societal challenges that we're trying to tackle are these ones in the middle: the human health, disaster risk reduction, water security, food security, and then climate change. So the mitigation component would be here. So this would be the 5 challenges. Often, as Thomas mentioned, these benefits or the societal challenges are interrelated. So you do one and you start to get things for the other ones. However, what the clarification that we do here is, on the one hand side, we regardless of the societal challenge that we want to focus primarily on, we need to have 2 co-benefits for sure, right? And one is the net biodiversity gain. So whatever we do on the nature-based solution space in these other areas, we have to have a net gain in biodiversity. And on the other hand, the socioeconomic development side of things. But we say this needs to be local. So it's not that by creating carbon credits that are traded and really very little stays on the ground that we have a good nature-based solution. So that's really important. And the other message that we want to emphasize here is that looking at a landscape level or having a landscape level perspective is very, very important. Not only because of the interlinkages and some of the things that Bronson just talked about, also in terms of diversifying risk. That's also very important, but also for the resilience part of things, which which also it's connected to risk. So climate smarting our interventions at the landscape level is very, very important to allow for these things to happen. The other thing is that some of the co-benefits that happen with nature-based solutions, one very, very tangible that we have found is the creation of jobs. So also in a report that we published, not this year, but last year, called Nature Hires Report, we compare a set of about 10 different nature-based solutions, with afforestation and reforestation having quite a very, very good job creation per US dollar invested, and probably much higher than any of the gray solutions out there in terms of recovery. So that's also something to consider. In terms of the net biodiversity gain, I already mentioned it, and Thomas mentioned it a little bit, but I think we often forget that biodiversity is actually a pressing issue to society, that we are reaching a limit that not only should weigh on us economically, but morally. And just thinking about that, we have lost 60% of all species in the past 100 years is just an unbearable thought, for me at least, right? And so how do we make sure that what we do, and using the climate momentum out there, we actually use it in a way in which we can reverse biodiversity loss by 2030 and start to be net positive after or by 2030 is a critical goal to be having by all of us. So how to do these things properly, at least on the ground? This touches upon what Thomas just mentioned. Even if you have climate as your focus, the nature-based solutions for climate mitigation must deliver for people, nature, and climate at the same time. And in some of our interventions, sometimes we actually look at the mitigation as a co-benefit, but we're definitely measuring it. Scale matters. Scale matters as it reduces the risk for many things in terms of permanence, in terms of resilience, but also in terms of accountability. And so scales allows for accountability, less leakage, as Bronson was saying, but also it allows us we should prioritize landscapes, not tradable credits. Tradable credits are a small piece of the puzzle. Maybe this is one of the areas where probably I don't know if I'm going to defer with Bronson on this one, but really we're seeing the voluntary carbon market space as being shrinking, or should be shrinking, as compliance markets start to get bigger, and then carbon pricing or carbon taxation starts to get bigger as well. And of course, intervention should be transparent, credible, and sustainable. So there's something coming out of Glasgow, which is definitely the credibility side of things. So results-based statements and the credibility of mitigation is crucially important. So how to finance these things? We continue to think that the part on residual emissions from companies is an important source, but as we move forward and as I mentioned before, we have to think about the decarbonization trajectory of companies, which should be the same that we ask for from countries. So this deep decarbonization that is aligned with Paris. This red piece here is a traditional or outdated offset. So these are completely out of the game for us. No offsets within value chains. But there's these offsets on residual emissions that could happen. So we are putting more or less the offsets on these residual emissions bit here. It doesn't have to happen in 2050. They could happen much earlier. But the blue side here, it's an area where at the end of the day is our residual, our remaining emissions, not residual emissions, but our remaining emissions below the curve and what we are calling beyond value chain mitigation. And this beyond value chain mitigation must be internalized. So it must be internalized by different means, carbon taxing or whatever. In any case, we think that an approach for doing this is actually costing what this area is here. And you can do several things with this area. You can invest in R&D for further decarbonization. You can invest in result-based, nature-based solution, which is exactly what we're talking now, or you can buy and retire authorized IGMOs. And these part here are still a lot of discussions around here, where after Article 6 happened now in Glasgow, and how will that happen? So at the moment, what we are proposing and we're pushing very strongly is for companies to go beyond their value chain and start to invest in nature-based solutions that desirably at a jurisdictional scale, as my colleagues mentioned. This is a paper that I found recently from Cook, Patton et al. in Nature. And I thought it was very, very useful, not to tackle the durability or permanence issue, but just thinking about the different aspects of the time horizon, the cost effectiveness, the biodiversity value and land use change, and the flux density in the different options. And as you see, probably this is also a case of all hands on deck, in the sense of we probably need to protect, to manage, and restore, and each of the different alternatives will have different trade-offs. And what it is important is to put them on the table and make them evident right from the beginning. And just the last one, because I think the big elephant in the room for nature-based solutions for carbon removals is the issue of permanence or durability that Bronson already mentioned. And there's four ways that we can deal with permanence. One is to ensure, to have insurance over, and there's very, very good models that can ensure what is going to be the fluxes, and what are going to be the gains and the losses, and to have a good insurance. And at the end of the day, even if we pay for the social price of carbon, which I think it should be around, more than $30 a ton, and definitely not $5 a ton, it is still below what a company would permit, or what a leading company would accommodate within their private utility function. So that would be around, in our calculation, something in between $60 and $80. So there's still a space there to ensure what we're going to do on nature-based solutions. The other one, as Bronson mentioned, is scale, and really do things at scale and at the landscape level for many reasons, but one is a permanence issue. Governance, invest in governance, and I think many of the projects, and that's why also scale is important. Many of the projects, if you do $5 a ton, of course, they're not going to invest in governance. And governance at the local level, at the regional level, at the national level is really, really important to ensure permanence of these solutions over time. And then of course think about other ways in which to ensure permanence, and for the better, which all of us have been very insistent in trying to promote the nature-based solutions, because they do provide for sustainability, or they do address sustainable development goals, and also biodiversity, which is actually the top planetary limit at the moment. So that's all from my end.
Great. Thank you so much, Vanessa and Bronson and Tom. So we're going to spend the next half hour or so on Q&A with the speakers. You all can go ahead and unmute and get on video and ask the questions yourselves. In the bottom of the screen, there's a reactions icon. If you click that, there's an option to raise your hand. So let's use that function to ask questions, and I can see whose hands are raised, and I will call out your name to ask the questions in that order. So to start out, let's see here. Okay, Joseph Tapper. We have a question from Joseph Tapper, so go ahead and ask your question, Joseph.
There we go. Hi, our process uses sulfuric acid as a feedstock. The sulfuric acid is a mitigating waste product of the steel industry to reduce sulfur dioxide emissions. And I'm trying to work out how that counts in terms of a scope 1 emission. It doesn't, whether any CO2 emissions associated with that would count towards my emissions.
Bronson, do you want to take that? I wouldn't necessarily know exactly how to tackle that.
Yeah, but I think Vanessa and I are both going to dodge that one.
I can
great question,
but
we have other judges on the panel that have more expertise in that space. But over to you, Precious.
Yeah, thanks. I can speak to that one real quick. Great question. You will see a template called LEAF. This is what we're using essentially to execute LCA. Every feedstock will either have a standardized CO2 footprint that we have asked some economists to estimate. I don't think sulfuric acid is there. So in that case, this will be sort of not quite choose your own adventure, but we will ask you. So we will ask you to come up with an approximate carbon intensity for all of your feedstocks, including sulfuric acid. Does that make sense?
Okay. Yeah, no, that's fine. Thank you.
So, whatever, if it's like you're using so many kilos of sulfuric acid, this will count. And this will be part of the, is it net negative or not accounting.
Yeah. Okay. No problem. Thank you.
Back to you, Roopa.
Okay, great, thanks. And just a reminder, when you're done asking the question, you can go ahead and lower your hand so I can see the most up-to-date list of who's asking questions. The next question we have is from Anthony Tatum.
Hey, good morning. Thanks for your time today. My question is regarding the stream table and the mass energy balance Excel file, which is part of the documentation. So if I were to be growing, let's say, a 40-hectare forest, the stream table asks for component flow rates in kilograms per hour. So some of my inputs would be things like saplings and then air, of course. Do I have to account for everything like autotrophic and heterotrophic respiration, air intake, saplings, and a kilogram per hour measurement? I'm a little confused on how to calculate all that.
Yeah, great question. Mike Leach is the best person to answer. I can try to answer it if you're not here, but Mike, are you around? Okay, I think Mike might be in the other Zoom. Trying to make sure people aren't lost. Yes, great question. Look, the concept of the stream table is, we think is a good fit for just about any process, but it'll take a little bit of creativity to fit every process inside of that rough structure. So I think you're hitting on, a great question here. I think there isn't necessarily a correct answer here. The most important thing and the purpose of the stream table is let the judges know what all of your inputs and outputs are so that they just have a sense of all the material and especially carbon and mass and energy fluxes inside and outside of your system. So there are probably a couple of ways you could, let's say, think about saplings or other inputs in the streams. So there are probably a couple of ways you can do it. I'm sorry, this is a bit of a vague answer, but the reason is there are a few ways you can actually go about doing this. We're not going to be too prescriptive. that it needs to be done a certain way. Remember, the basic principle is we just want you to map out all of your inputs and outputs so that that is clear to the judges so they can get a good sense of what your system is. Sorry for the vagueness, but I hope that is helpful. And if it isn't,
That is,
fire a follow-up.
appreciate it.
Okay.
Yeah.
I'll just quickly add that this might be, I mean, obviously follow exactly what Marcia's just described, but I would just add that there are, a lot of, for whatever the intervention that you're proposing, there may be some respected accounting standards that exist out there and that have worked through and sort of thought through the question about what are the major pools and fluxes and what are the really kind of de minimis pools and fluxes involved with a certain type of intervention. Like, do you account for every leaf that falls, or are you just looking at the large, the bowl volume and other things like that? I mean, so I'm just saying that you, in order to sort of help justify sort of the emphasis of your accounting and where you're spending more time on in working through the numbers, one good way to justify that would be either just from the scientific literature or probably better yet, accounting methodologies that might be available. Obviously, if there are cases where there are not available, then sort of thinking about a prior response on this is like, it's kind of carte blanche and you have to, you just have to propose the logic.
Okay, makes sense. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Our next question is from Dahl Winters.
Hello, everyone. Thank you for your time today. My question is really simple. I was curious about the accounting for biochar and where, if the biochar is being placed within a material that is very permanent, what would be the most effective way of actually showing that? Would it be through leaf, or would it be through literature sources, or so on? Or would it be up to us to provide the necessary data?
Great question. If you are using a form of biochar that, let's say, is well known in the literature or possibly from your own measurements to be stable, cite that. So, this is not biochar, but an extreme example would be somebody that wants to do mineralization. They say, I'm going to make calcium carbonate and, put it in mine. Like, all right, it's well known, calcium carbonate stable, fine. If you are using a form of biochar that is, let's say, not well known in the literature to be stable, either provide evidence that you think of its stability, or even better measurements that you may have conducted. So I hope that's helpful. And then if you, I'm not quite sure what you mean about biochar in a different form, but if there's some kind of other use or management system that comes along with the biochar, make sure you do some thinking about any instability that could be created through the system, or maybe increase stability, kind of as Bronson alluded to earlier.
But to clarify that, I meant biochar in a different form, meaning that the biochar is being encapsulated within a solid material that resists degradation. So
Right.
that would encompass us needing to provide our own data, or can we cite literature sources that show the stability?
Sort of up to you, depending on what that solid material is. If it's a well-known process that's well described in literature, feel free to cite that. If it's something new that you may have developed or is not yet too well studied, better if you can provide some measurements.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, next question is from Marcel de Berg.
Thank you. With the Green Water Cools Collective and the Eco Restoration Team, we focus on restoring the cooling power of our planet by restoring the clean water cycle. What if we can prove that this benefit is much bigger than the benefit of the harvested CO2 and all the other co-benefits together? How would you weigh that in your judgment?
That's a great question. The fundamental requirement for the competition is CO2 removal. There are, arguably depending on your context, there are going to be things that are more important than CO2 removal for different types of nature-based or climate interventions. But this competition is about CO2 removal. That said, the place to articulate other co-benefits for credit is in the sustainably scaling portion of the proposal. So we're asking the judge to look at CO2 and look at all teams CO2, but then there's also opportunity to look at co-benefits elsewhere. So co-benefits don't replace CO2 removal benefits, but judges are free to look at them in addition to, just as the judges are free to look at additional risks that may non-CO2 risks that may be developed by your.
Okay. But what if you can prove? But what if you can prove
Yeah.
that the co-benefit of restoring the clean water cycle is much bigger and much more important for society than the removal of CO2, which is a co-benefit from our point of view by restoring the clean water cycle. So if you can prove that, would that also be somebody that the judge will reward the prize for it, because it's much bigger than the removal of CO2?
That's a great question. The answer is no. For instance, I'm going to use a ridiculous example, but it's a similar argument. Many people have said not preventing CO2 emissions in the first place is more important. Okay, it's clear we have to do aggressive mitigation. What if I have a solution that prevents CO2 from being generated in the first place? And our response is, that's really fantastic and important, and we should do that, but that's just not the scope of this competition.
Okay.
And something, I mean, of course, I'm not the judge of this, and the team would better judge this, but I guess it's a matter of comparison and scale. So I just bearing in mind that if you have like two similar, carbon removal solutions, and one creates a larger co-benefit, you definitely want to measure it and make it really, really relevant, right? So I think that's what we're talking here, right? So the scope of this competition is focused on the mitigation side, and we should get that straight. But getting the co-benefits measured and upfront, and of course comparing one that would be superior to the other one, no? So it's in a kind of ceteris paribus kind of way, no? Yeah.
Okay.
So we're going for the better, but we're trying to get the carbon removal sorted, and then the best carbon removal solutions be priced. No, that's
okay. Well, that will be easy. Okay, thank you.
I'll just flag one other very technical point, which is that you, to the extent that we want to make sure it's a net accounting, right? So like, for example, it is often, so for example, if you're, let's say, putting in a new forest, or planting a new forest, sometimes there are treatments that need to be done in order to initiate that, and there can be emissions associated with that. So just flagging that when you're accounting for removals in the land sector space, we need to make sure that we're also deducting if the intervention involves an emission to get to that removal.
Okay, next question is from Rob Lavoie.
Hi, this might be obvious and also possibly controversial if I bring it up and put it on the table, but I just want to, I think I've been reassured by the previous speakers about co-benefits and the differences between projects when you look at co-benefits. So the example I'm going to give is just, if you take two projects, one would be BECCS with carbon capture and geological sequestration of CO2 versus a similar BECCS project, but a biochar sequestration into soil solution for the capture and storage of the carbon from the BECCS, from the bioenergy project. Clearly there would be much greater co-benefits in the biochar to soil rather than carbon to geological sequestration. Am I understanding that correctly, and that the judges are going to be aware of and cognizant of those differences in co-benefits between projects like that?
Well, I'll just jump in and say, yeah, for my part, yeah, I think simple answer is yes, that is something I think we should be paying attention to. And so in a sense, if you've got, you know, of course, it will never be sort of perfectly comparable, but if you imagine the carbon accounting works out the same, but then you have with sort of greater co-benefits, then certainly the advantage would be to the solution that offers greater co-benefits. And I also would flag one thing to consider in this is that, you know, what's wonderful and complex about the land space is that, you know, any intervention, you know, can have, you know, there's sort of the wings of the butterfly, right? Like people are in most landscapes, and it's and you know, ecosystems are complex. So if you're let's say using crop residue for your source or crops themselves, that's pulling nutrients out of the system, right, and taking them out, and then doing something with them, right? Whether it's for storage underground or for biochar. Now, in the case of biochar, what hopefully you're doing is then returning those carbon and nutrients back into the soil, so that you're avoiding actually not, you know, you could have a net benefit for the soil, but you can also at least avoid a perverse negative for the soil. Whereas, you know, keep in mind that when we're just talking about a removal of biomass from a land system and putting it into a long-term kind of underground or whatever other storage that's not part of a living ecosystem, there is a negative effect that has to be considered or discussed and kind of worked through.
So you're pointing out the differences between two possible biochar projects. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. Exactly. Or any. I mean, I think what I would flag for folks is that when I think there's often an assumption when you come at it from the technology space, you know, of like, oh, you know, you sort of pull carbon out of a pollutant, you know, emission stack or something like that. There's no perverse problem there of pulling carbon out, but there is when you're pulling the carbon out of many, not all, but many land systems, right? Because there's not enough carbon. Like soils have been degraded of nutrients and carbon for such a long time that when you anyway, I think you get my point. I think the difference, it's a little different in oceans, because oceans, but I won't go down in the weeds, but I just want to flag that issue.
I guess the only thing I just want to leave this with is it seems to me it's going to be rather subjective how the judges can tease apart the co-benefit differences, but that may be too difficult a question to answer in this forum. So thank you very much. Appreciate that.
Well, I'll just say anything you can do to help us
okay.
be less subjective, that would be welcome.
Okay.
Thank you. The next question is from Nicholas Seat. Nicholas Seat. Okay, we'll move to the next person. Next question is from Ning Dang. Oh,
Okay.
Nicholas. Okay, go ahead.
Oh, I'm sorry about that. I've been, we are snowed in, all of our power's out because trees fell over on the power lines.
Oh,
It's
my.
really mayhem. And so all the babies are home and it's just crazy. But this is all climate change. We're living in it. So firstly, I want to thank the speakers. Very informative session. My concern, which I'd like to ask at this stage, is where does afforestation fit in your roadmap? For instance, Bronson, it wasn't even on your slide. And that really has me concerned because our solution, which is afforesting desert regions, we're just not even on the map. So how can you effectively judge something like that since it's it's not even on your roadmap? So for instance, we would be claiming that we can go carbon negative to the 8 gigaton level by afforesting 2% of the world's deserts, which is something that we have pretty practically mapped out using our water technology and saline water and government support, of course. But, so my concern is that we won't even get out the gate because it's not something that you're even accounting for.
So let me, just to flag. So I just pulled up the slide that I just presented, and reforestation is the first one on the list. And in the Rowe et al, it also includes reforestation and afforestation. So indeed, it is included in what I presented. Sorry, I'm just trying to stop share. But I also just will flag that we definitely did not, whereas we did include what you're referring to, we have not included everything that could be proposed. It's not, I don't want to suggest that we have a sort of a comprehensive list. Essentially it's really up to, to each group to propose and, justify the concept. And, we're all for innovation here. So don't please don't feel as if, something I presented is kind of constraining approaches.
Thank you so much.
I'm sorry.
That's what I wanted to hear. Thank you.
Yeah, great. And I will say this though, just as an example, again, is to keep in mind, like, afforestation, we did intentionally, in my study I put forward, talk about reforestation or restoration of forest cover. We don't refer to afforestation. Now, again, these terms are tricky and it depends on the source, but putting a non-native forest into an ecosystem where forest cover is not native it can be done. It's not, I'm not saying it's can't be considered, but I'm just saying one of the things that would flag for me is that you are, there is a xeric ecosystem diversity and complexity to that system, which is going to be replaced by an exotic species. That would be considered as a negative in terms of biodiversity. So, and other sort of ripple effects that need to be considered when you are taking a native ecosystem and turning it into something else. So I just want to flag that it's again, it's not, I'm not saying there's lots of innovative things we need to be exploring here. I just want to make sure that people are aware that, like, when there's a sort of a negative impact, it doesn't mean you can't do it. It just means you need to explain kind of, or justify why, how is that being considered or addressed or monitored.
Okay, the next question we have is from Ning Zhang.
You hear me?
Yes.
Great. My camera seems to be having some trouble. And first, I appreciate the panelists' emphasis on co-benefits. I think that's really the biggest thing about nature-based solutions. My question is actually somewhat technical. It's as much for the panelists as well as for the XPRIZE team. So I'm from the team called Wood Vault, work on an idea called wood harvesting and storage, or biomass burial. And we've been working on this for 15 years now. And the idea has appeared, for example, in National Academy report, but did not appear in some, for example, Smith et al. Review on these methods. So the characteristic of this method is it's a combined nature plus engineering. So we do need photosynthesis to do the capture, but it requires human management, rather carefully constructed facilities to keep the harvested carbon out of the active biosphere. So really it's out of the active biosphere. So practically all the other nature methods are in the active biosphere, vegetation or soil. So this goes into the geological reservoir, really becomes sedimentary. So the idea has fallen through cracks at different places. So when I registered the team, I hesitated for a long time. Should I choose nature, land, or should I choose rock? So I did choose nature. So my question for the XPRIZE team and the judges are, how do you ensure an idea like this that straddles the boundary of different boxes to be fairly assessed and given full consideration in terms of its unique aspects?
Hi, everyone. Let me take a swing at that one. That's a very good question. And the answer around the tracks and how we consider, what you might call hybrid approaches or approaches that are rooted in more than one track is a really good one. We are really looking forward to seeing a lot of hybrid approaches. We've talked to a lot of people who are bringing forward approaches that are very kind of intersectional across different tracks. The point of choosing the track, it really has nothing to do with who you're going to be competing against in the competition, because all of the judges ultimately will review all of the winning submissions. However, we do pre-screening with experts in different fields. And the point of selecting the tracks is to try and make sure that your application, your submission, makes it to the right expert from the get-go. And if you choose the wrong one, it's not a huge deal. We'll have a mechanism for making sure that your project gets rerouted to the appropriate experts. But so the message is you don't have to worry too much about which track you choose. It has no bearing on the requirements that you have to meet, and it really has no bearing on who you're going to be competing against, because everybody's in the same pool. So I hope that allays your concerns. When you are choosing your track, try to think about, okay, well, what type of expert would be best positioned to read and understand my proposal, and we'll take it from there.
Thank you, Michael.
Okay, thank you. Next question up is from Joshua Brunick. Joshua, you ready to ask?
Yes, I was just unmuting.
Great.
Okay, so my question is similar to Ning's there. We actually have some very key partnerships between 3 companies. One is a conservation organization which manages 3 of our land projects, which is reforestation through 7-layer food forests, gilded food forests. Then we have multi-layer cropping systems, and then a regenerative agriculture with livestock. That is the actual land projects that we're managing. But one other key partnership is with Oxygen, which is who I'm representing today. Because that's our main focus with the technology aspect. We're integrating blockchain technology into this space. And my question is, on the recording aspect, how do we present that type of relationship, and how are we supposed to record? Do we just focus on like Najoni's aspect with the conservation, or do we also tie in like our other key partnerships? Whereas like blockchain can take a lot of electricity and put out a lot of other resources like high outputs, but we've managed to reverse that and not do the same techniques as current blockchain systems. So we're actually in a negative ourselves. So we want to be able to present that as also carbon negative efforts. So I just want to know, like, how would we present the data on both of those aspects?
Yeah, that's a good question. So I think, I mean, if we just kind of take a step back to the primary goal of the competition, our goal is to remove tons of CO2. And so I think being able to articulate how that process is accomplished is the main goal of the submission there. So, we ask for drawings, and we ask for other documentation and descriptions of how that process actually works, and focusing on how that carbon goes from the air or the surface layer of the ocean into a sequestered state is like the primary thing. Beyond that, it's a question of what costs are associated with this process and what emissions are associated with that process. That's kind of like the second layer, and that's where we get into the costing exercise and the emissions assessment. And there's opportunities in the submission to provide some justification in each of those areas, and so you might be able to highlight some of your work across those areas. And then the final thing is around the sustainability criteria. That's where you can really make a case for the co-benefits. In this round of the competition, we're not focused on really getting into the nitty-gritty of quantifying the co-benefits, although you're invited to if that's possible. But articulating what those co-benefits are and how they relate to the system and how they scale as your concept grows is kind of the final piece of the puzzle. So maybe a abstract answer to your question, but does that kind of get at it?
Kind of, but it opens one more if I could. So then the co-benefits, if we're operating at a negative, being recorded through like the Paris Agreement and collecting carbon crediting and stuff like that, is that a viable, like showing that is like carbon negative and a means to collect carbon credits off of our processes? Would that kind of count as a recording for carbon negative, or is it specifically the actual drawdown of carbon from the atmosphere? Can it not be like I guess that would be like a secondary, like a not direct means, but that would be kind of like a secondary means. Is that still recordable, or is that not? Is that more of a co-benefit kind of area there?
Right. So, I mean, okay. I think I understand. So fundamentally, we need to understand like the physical mechanism of how the carbon is being drawn down. That needs to be the core of the proposal. But systems for improving the accountability of that drawdown are certainly part of the picture. That can be sort of part of your like unique selling proposition. But we do need to get right down to the details about like technically and physically, how are the molecules, coming out of the air or oceans and being sequestered.
Mike, I'm going to attempt to add something to your point, but I want to defer to you on if I'm getting this right.
No, please, yeah.
One way I think of it is that you have a removal, and that, as Mike just said, that's the core of kind of your counting. But from my perspective, one would deduct from that removal an emission that is necessary to achieve that removal. So it's a net removal that we want to understand. But you don't get to add. But then you don't get. Then there's not the addition of an avoided emission, right? If it's so you deduct an emission that's necessary for the removal, but then you don't get to like add also a bunch of it. And that gets to the scope question that Marcia's pointed out. Even though I will say it's certainly useful to understand that that's happening because we care about that. It's just that I think that's a scope question.
Well, let me clarify it a little bit better, because we've built a platform that supports other carbon negative initiatives. Okay, so what we're doing is we're integrating. Nijoni is essentially a pilot for oxygen, because oxygen is going to be a supportive platform for other negative projects, and those negative projects might not be part of the XPRIZE, but it's part of oxygen now. So when they become part of oxygen, it becomes part of oxygen's negative removal, and the way that we track that is through crediting and through our blockchain database. So the measurements and all that would be recorded, but it wouldn't be necessarily under Nijoni. It would be under a project that we support, right? So that we actually fund and we help make possible. So when that happens, that's direct carbon removal. But again, similar to the relationship between Nijoni and oxygen, like how do we link that? Because we are Nijoni, that is a key partnership, but we're the pilot. So when we get a secondary project on board, how do we integrate, because we plan to within the next 4 years, how do we integrate those carbon drawdowns into our readings, our measurement? Like, are we allowed to, like, does that actually count for our removal? Because it would be then a partnered project as well. Would that be part of our carbon drawdown, or would that be somebody else's and we can't claim it, even though we're the ones that are essentially fostering that initiative, that ability to draw that carbon down? Like, there will be a key partnership, they will be part of the program, that would be the efforts that we're supporting. So do we actually claim those credit, like those carbon drawdown, or do we not? Does that make sense?
Yeah, I mean, I think you can. There is, you're bringing up some issues around kind of like additionality and double counting and stuff like that are real issues. So, it sounds like, and it kind of sounds like your approach is oriented at trying to prevent that, which is a good thing. The answer from the competitive perspective, the XPRIZE administration perspective, is you can use those projects, but you have to bring that project kind of into your team, and it's important that we can't have teams in the competition pointing at another team and saying that's my demonstration. You know what I mean? So as provided they're willing to sort of like join with you in that effort.
Right. We'll hold a standard that they would have to meet, and that would be the baseline. So it would all be done the same way, and that's why I was asking that question specifically, because it would not be a secondary project. It would be, they bring on their project onto the platform and it becomes one thing. And that's why I was trying to define those lines. But thank you.
Yeah. I think the answer is yes. There's a bit of kind of proceed with caution there, but we don't want to discourage you.
Thank you. Appreciate that.
Okay, thanks. Next question we have is from Scott Hamilton Brim.
Hi, thank you. Hopefully my question is going to be a simple one. It's regarding the LEAF worksheet. We're trying to enter in the data into the entry page tab, and we're getting an error that requires a password of some sort. And also we're looking for the carbon intensities for various energy sources. So we feel it's in this document, but we're encountering problems with this file that you download.
Yeah, that issue, I was made aware of that issue this morning. So we'll take a look at that and issue a revision to that template to make sure that it works for you. I believe that the carbon intensities, there are some carbon intensities in one of the tabs in the worksheet. So take a look there. If you're having other problems, though, feel free to send us an email, carbonremoval@xprize.org. The full team has access to that email address, and we'll do our best to resolve anything that you throw at us as quick as we can.
Okay, thank you. And the tab for the carbon intensities, I think it's like the last tab on it, but is that meant to be all inclusive, or is there we can't add stuff?
No. So if there's something that isn't on the list, there's a section of the LEAF where you can input your own carbon intensity if it isn't on the list already. So especially with there's no way that we could have included all of the possible feedstocks that are in play in the competition. So there is an element of each team will have to come up with carbon intensity factors for parts of their process. But that list is kind of a starting point.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, question from Fred Briones.
Hello. Hi.
Hi.
My name is Fred Briones, CEO of the Native American Fiber Program I'm an enrolled tribal member at the Big Valley Rancheria Band of Pomo Indians located in Lakeport, California. And I don't have a technical question like everybody else. My question is more Musk Foundation strategic funding. And I see that there's several different categories all bunched together competing for funding. You know, this is a contest, first place, second place, third place. And I'm curious to know the weight of the funding where it's very competitive in foundations and philanthropy, where I see lots of philanthropy, for example, the Earth Fund or the Bezos Earth Foundation, funding heavily already 100 million to seaweed. And it makes me chuckle as an indigenous person because my tribe has been harvesting seaweed for 20,000 years on the coast of California. So, and I see these people just commercialize seaweed farmers who are in potential danger in 5 years from ocean plastic pollution, which could just literally destroy that whole industry. And I'm just curious, you know, the funding, and when that happens, humanity is faced on land. We're on land, and that living between man and land. Now, how weighted does that come for our tribal peoples who've been here for 20,000 years? So to now move into a future, create a future for the next 20,000, it takes strategic funding to be innovative during these times on land. So how focused, how weighted is land compared to other ocean and air? I hope that makes sense.
Yeah, that's a good question, and I definitely I really appreciate your perspective on this. The answer is we don't have any quotas for any specific types of solutions. Our focus really is on the outcomes in terms of carbon removal and verifiable carbon removal. Beyond that, we don't want to necessarily presuppose that one track is better than the other. And one important point that I want to make is that the winner of the XPRIZE does not represent the best solution type. The winner of the XPRIZE will represent the best, project or the best operation. So there really is a strong element in this competition that, all of our competitions are focused on performance of a team and not trying to define like the overall sort of abstract winners and losers. I hope that makes sense.
Yes, it does. And I just want to, again, just say that, there's so much how you emphasize on like detailed oriented project, how well, and there's already a model, that seaweed modeling. And I strongly feel it's kind of just out, it's unfortunate, and I just hope that the Bus Foundation does see other strategic programming, because the reason that brings us all together is climate change and how to mitigate climate change. Of that perspective, is on land. So the weight of the funding, I just strongly advocate for people on land. We live on land. So thank you.
Yeah, thanks for that perspective. Yeah.
Okay, next question is from Christopher Cogswell.
Hey, everyone. My question is a bit, I guess it's sort of a question generally for folks who on this call, I would assume know a lot more about the natural cycles of CO2 sequestration and conversion than I do as sort of a catalyst and nanomaterials guy. is there any consideration for the speed with which carbon is removed from the atmosphere or from these other streams and the potential knockback effect? So, for example, is there a, I think of the CO2 in the atmosphere as sort of a dynamic chemical system, right? So if we remove too much CO2 at once, is there, I guess the simplest way to ask the question is there are there guidelines or is there a preferable timeline of removal per year that we should be aiming for? So, if you remove a gigaton in a year, that may have unintended consequences to other natural environments as they try to recoup that carbon loss versus, say, others. So is there a goal timeline, I guess, or those things like that we should be aiming for?
Yeah, that's a really good question. And I have to say that I don't know the specific answer. I think there are a lot of experts that are looking at issues like that. What I do know is that that's not a short-term problem. That's not a problem that we're going to encounter sort of within the scope of this competition or likely even in the next 10 or 20 years, because the system is so large. So at this point in time, there's only benefits to removing as much carbon as we can. The problem is the gigaton numbers are just so big. So if we can scratch the surface and start developing the mechanisms to doing that drawdown, I don't mean to kick the can down the lane, but that's kind of what we're doing here is we need to prevent a temperature overshoot scenario. And then fortunately, the good news is we're really good at emitting carbon. That's not an issue scaling up those technologies.
Sure. Yeah, of course. Yeah. I just didn't know if that was something we were, I always think about that Simpsons episode where they have the lizards that are taking over the birds and they introduce bears and they introduce snakes. It's a continuous problem.
It's not a bad question. I'd invite if any of my colleagues want to pitch in ideas on this, because I don't know the specific answer, but I just from my perspective running the competition, it's about scaling up literally as quickly as we can today, and certainly there's we'll have to take on the responsibility for making sure that we get it right as these systems scale to become significant at the climate scale.
Yeah, I mean, we could always just, I don't know, have a big bonfire or something, I guess. All right, thank you.
Okay, I think we have time for a couple more questions, and then we are going to go ahead and get into our breakout sessions. So the next question we have is from Craig Jameson.
Hi, from the UK. My question is probably for Mike. It's a little bit, we've got a bit of a complex multi sort of sectoral proposal, but it's around rice. Rice is emitting as much greenhouse gas as all the other crops in the world combined. And we found a way to harvest and rescue the waste biomass, which is part of the cause of that problem, the straw. We obviously don't want people to become lazy and think, oh yeah, we can offset, using this technology, we can offset our emissions. We want the underlying emissions of rice to come down as low as possible, and then to offset in other places if, where that's possible. But my question then is, what we do with this potentially hundreds of millions of tons of rice straw, when we store carbon through that, where do we start counting? Is it, first of all, in reducing the emissions from the rice itself, or do we count our emission savings and stored carbon from the first ton that of carbon that we store from the straw? I'm not making it very clear, but do you see what I mean? We've got to offset from the crop itself as well as from other things.
Yeah, good question. Good question. I think the issue of what I'm understanding in your question is kind of like what is the boundary condition of your system? And the answer is the answer is the boundary has to start at the atmosphere, sort of at the point of where the CO2 enters the system, and it has to be inclusive of the full process of sequestering and ultimately keeping that CO2 sequestered for, at least 100 years. And everything inside that box needs to be accounted for, either as a sink of emissions or as a source of emissions. So, your question kind of had system elements of it. It also had some temporal elements of it. But did I get at it?
Well, let's say we plant trees to offset the emissions from the rice, and then we store carbon from what we do with the straw. Okay, so are we counting both of those in this, or we want to get to carbon neutral rice before we go carbon negative?
The answer is you have to throw everything in the box. Everything involved in your system kind of is in the box, and then each one of those sub elements has emissions associated with it, and some of them have drawdown associated with it. So and then on balance, are you CO2 negative is the question.
Okay, so it's counting the emissions after we've made rice carbon negative, carbon neutral. Basically, it's everything below that counts.
Yeah.
So the methane emissions or whatever from the rice production count against us to begin with.
Yes, essentially yes. Yes.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, Craig's question has a lot to do with like what our questions are about, the kind of like where do we draw the line for the slippery slope on that like idea of, are we supposed to calculate all the way to the farms, or are we supposed to just start where we touch the product? Like, I don't know if we have time to answer this right now, but I just wanted to jump in because our question piggybacks off of his.
Yeah, I mean, it's like, it's a little bit abstract unless we get into the specifics, right? But the idea is that the definition of the system needs to be as holistic and as inclusive as possible. And so, you basically any aspect of the system that's sort of critical to the operation of the system needs to be included as, either a source of emissions or a sink of emissions. So if you're working with many partners on the ground, for example, all of those operations, the emissions associated with all of those operations do need to be included.
Okay, and like if we offset those emissions, or like if we're in a sense offsetting those emissions by taking them rather than them being like emitted in the normal processes, that doesn't necessarily count towards the carbon sequestration numbers?
Well, provided that you're taking those emissions and sequestering them in a durable way, then yeah, that kind of like stays in the system. But any emissions associated with your project that return to atmosphere need to be accounted for.
Is that even like, say we're using Teslas, is that even accounting for like the Tesla emissions from mining the lithium or the Ryobi tool set that we're using? Like, do we have to account for the emissions created from those things in our processes as well?
Yeah, that's a good question. We had a question yesterday about vehicles and whether the emissions associated with manufacturing vehicles needs to be considered. I think the answer I think is yes, but the good news is most consumer goods, automobiles and ships and stuff like that, have fairly well established carbon intensities, or ones that can at least be approximated.
Okay, that makes sense.
Okay, I think we are going to take one last question. This question is from Christian.
Hi, I just wanted to ask, when you are talking about sequestration, will the increase in organic matter in the soil count for it, or should it only be through biochar?
Sorry, can you just repeat the question? I just missed the first couple words.
sorry, if we increase the organic materials in soils, organic matter, will it also count for CO2 sequestration, or it needs to be only through biochar?
Yeah, great question. The answer is it counts, provided you can show that it will stay sequestered for at least 100 years. So there's even within biochar, it's not guaranteed that the CO2 will stay sequestered. It depends on the chemical composition of the biochar. So regardless of what it is you're doing, and it sounds like you're thinking about how to count the molecules that go into the soil. That's really important. What we need to do is have confidence that that we know how many of those molecules are going to escape back to the atmosphere within 100 years.
Yeah, I just want to emphasize, to build on Mike's point and response, is that it is not, so one option, and this is just, I guess, re-emphasizing something as I mentioned at the beginning, you don't have to guarantee that every molecule that's removed persists for 100 years, but to the extent that you have, so in soil carbon, it would be less, there's a higher probability that some of that removal will be re-emitted, but you just need to estimate, you need to justify what that deduction is, and then be essentially be over delivering sufficiently to accommodate that deduction. I hope that makes sense, but bottom line is that anytime you're involving living ecosystems of both biomass and soil carbon and kind of the living soil, you are not talking, we're not talking about 100% chance that any given molecule of carbon is going to persist in a stored form for 100 years, but that by no means should make people think they can't store that form. In fact, the good part about, of course, everything we've been talking about with that is that there are all these co-benefits of having essentially carbon stored in living forms in soil and biomass. And so it's a question of applying the right deduction given the sort of probability of non-permanence.
Perfect, thanks.
Okay, great. All right, I think that's all we've got time for questions. We are definitely okay, everyone. Thanks for everyone who's stuck around for our networking. That concludes our land track session. Thanks for attending. Like I mentioned earlier, we'll be sending recordings of all our track sessions out once we're through with the summit at the end of the week. You all should have gotten a recording or a link to a folder that has our recordings from our main session that we had on Monday. If you didn't for some reason, contact us at carbonremoval@xprize.org. We'll also be posting them on POP as well once we've had some time to process everything. But thank you all for joining, and we'll hope to see you at some of the other sessions that we have this week. Thanks, everyone. Bye.
Thank you, Roopa.
Thank you, Roopa.
Bye, everyone.
Thank you.
Have a nice day.
Thank you. Good to meet you all. Everybody.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you. Goodbye.
Thank you.
Bye.
Nature is the answer. Nature is the answer.
Absolutely.